One of the big stories, though, this infected blood inquiries heard that two haemophiliacs lived with HIV for more than 2 years before doctors told them that they had the virus. Now, the patients had tested positive for HIV in 1984 after receiving a contaminated blood product made by the NHS in Scotland. Well, our reporter David Cowan's been listening to the inquiry, and he joins us now. And Dave, these two people were part of a large group who were infected in this way, weren't they?
Yes. In 1984, 23 people who were being treated for haemophilia in Edinburgh contracted HIV through a blood product called factor VIII. HIV, of course, can lead to AIDS, and we know that by 2011, of those 23, 19 were dead, and AIDS had been the cause or a factor in 14 of those deaths. The Infected Blood Inquiry has been hearing from Professor Christopher Ludlam, who was director at the Edinburgh Haemophilia Centre at the time. To recap on some of the evidence from yesterday very quickly, in 1983, it was known that haemophiliacs in the United States had contracted AIDS through factor VIII, that blood product, and 5 of them had died. But Professor Ludlam said that the Scottish factor VIII came from Scottish donors, and there were no cases of AIDS here at that time, so he thought it was safe. But late in 1984, he had samples from his patients tested without their knowledge and learned that some of them had been infected with HIV. 2 months later, he called all of his patients to a meeting at Edinburgh Royal Infirmary and told them the news, but in a very general way. And Dr. Ludlam told the inquiry what happened.
We were very open about the situation, about the testing, and particularly that we had results that we would be happy to share with the patients if they would like them. There was surprise and disappointment, and they were perplexed and upset.
So how were the patients told whether they had the virus?
Well, this is one of the major issues being examined by the inquiry. It was left up to them to ask. Dr. Ludlam says that most of the patients who were positive were told over the next few months, but a handful weren't. And it was more than 2 years before 2 of them were told. One found out late in 1986, the other early in 1987. Bear in mind, of course, that it was known at the time that HIV was a virus, it was infectious, and it can be spread through sexual contact, but they weren't told. Stepping away from the inquiry for a moment, let's listen to an interview from a BBC Scotland documentary from 2005. You're going to hear from Robert Mackey. He was one of those 2 individuals, and this is what he said about being given that news.
Dr. Ludlam said that you've been infected with HIV. Horrified, terrified, just shocked. I knew it was deadly. I knew enough to know it was going to kill me. My main concern then was for my wife and my son.
So for all that time, Robert Mackey didn't know that he'd caught the virus in 1984.
Yes, that's right. Robert Mackey's still alive. He said in that programme that at the meeting in 1984, he left with the impression that he would have been told if he'd had the virus. He hadn't come away thinking that he would have to ask if he had the virus. Back to the inquiry today, 36 years on, Professor Ludlam said he was very surprised that anyone would have left that meeting thinking that. After December 1984, the blood transfusion service started to heat treat those blood products. No one else was infected in that way. Professor Ludlam was asked about 2 other issues which were raised in that BBC documentary 15 years ago. Whether he knew in the 1980s that blood donations had been taken from Scottish prisons and from American servicemen on military bases in Scotland. He said he hadn't known that at the time. The infections that took place in Edinburgh weren't the only ones, of course. Across the UK, about 2,400 people died after being infected with HIV and hepatitis C through blood products in the 70s and 80s. And Professor Ludlam will continue giving his evidence tomorrow morning.
David Cowan, thank you.